Technology is changing rapidly, and it is a major investment to learn a new skill, technique, or technology. Our knowledge gained is so hard-fought that it is only natural to rely on it dearly. But it's a mistake to hold on to this knowledge for too long. You must be open to new ideas. In this episode of Mobycast, Chris shares with John a personal story about learning and growth. After being blindsided by relying on a familiar pattern, a valuable lesson is learned. One summed up well by author Stephen King when he implores us to kill your darlings. Welcome to Mobycast, a show about the techniques and technologies used by the best cloud-native software teams. Each week, your hosts John Christensen and Chris Hickman pick a software concept and dive deep to figure it out.
Welcome, Chris. It's another episode of Mobycast.
Hey, John. It's good to be back.
Good to have you back. And, we just saw each other in person yesterday in the great town of Denver, Colorado. That was pretty fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you were saying that you think Denver is kind of a foodie town.
Yeah, I would absolutely stick by that. So I'm just always blown away by, it seems like on every street corner, there's like this really like American bistro style restaurant that just does food and bar just like really, really, really well. And for me, it's a little bit of a head scratcher because whenever I do visit Denver, downtown Denver, it seems eerily quiet and really doesn't have nearly the amount of foot traffic that I would expect in such a large city. And so I'm just kind of like, where is everyone? But then there's all these like amazing like restaurants and bars and nightlife and stores and shopping and everything else. And it's like, obviously the people are there to support this, but It's like, how did they get there? Like that's what I don't understand.
I was thinking about that the other day and I was like, well, maybe we just have a little bit more space per square foot per person than most places. And that's just what we do in Denver. I don't know.
I don't know. It could be. It could be that the
wide streets. You can imagine like driving cattle down the wide roads.
Yeah.
Big open spaces.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
I think I have an actual answer for you. So here's my actual answer. Downtown Denver historically was never considered like a place to live. It was a place to go in and work. And people lived outside of it. I mean, maybe like in recent history, like, since the concept of suburbs came about. And so, it has some big apartment buildings, but not that many, compared to the number of just big old office buildings that there are. And so, whenever you're there and it's not people showing up to work time or people having lunchtime, it would probably seem pretty empty. And like if you were to add in like more living quarters, like more actual living units, I think it would look a lot busier. And I think that the cities that you think of as big American cities, like, even Seattle but especially San Francisco, New York City, Boston, they have more people living in their city area, the urban area. I think that's probably it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It still doesn't, it's like, it feels like it's still like pretty quiet, like 8 to 5 as well. So it's like, I would get it if it was like in the evenings, it was like, this feels like the business district of a large city, which is usually pretty much dead. Right. But yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there.
We'll have to ask the mayor.
Yeah.
It's not my home city either. I live up in the mountains, so I can't really speak as a true Denverite. Today we're going to talk about learning, but that sounds boring. So let's talk about it from the perspective of making mistakes. And that's something that everybody can relate to, I think. I've definitely made some mistakes that are related to what I maybe should have learned. And, if I had learned the thing, I would have been able to avoid a mistake. So this episode, we're calling it Kill Your Darlings, I think, right, Chris?
Maybe that's the subheading, if you will. I think maybe the clickbait title is, your most important skill.
Yes, that's right. I clicked over to the actual outline that tells me what to say. And it says right on the top, your most important skill. It doesn't say right on the top, kill your darlings.
Right. But kill your darlings is definitely like pretty catchy too, right? Like, what does that mean? Right. And we'll get into that too. Yeah.
Cool. So kick us off.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a little bit of a different episode of Mobycast, right? So we're not really going to be diving deep into some technology or talk about some methodology or way of doing things necessarily. Instead, this is kind of like, let's take a step back and just kind of relate something that really hit home recently while working on an episode of Mobycast. And it was one of those things, like for me personally, it really just kind of like blew my mind a bit. It really caught me off guard. And it really just drove home this point that I keep saying this, right? Like the rate of change with technology is just accelerating, right? It's really, especially in the cloud space, between the public cloud providers, we talk about like just mostly we talk about AWS on this podcast, and that's the one that we're most familiar with, but they are just launching new things at just a breakneck speed. They have armies of really talented, smart people that are all going and building lots of great things. And so on one hand, wow, that's awesome. Like look at all this technology and look how fast things are evolving. But on the other hand, it's like, holy moly, how can anyone keep up with this anymore? And if you think about it, like this is new, right? Like it hasn't been like this in the past. And so this really represents like a fundamental difference. Like in the past, like sure, technology changed and evolved, but it wasn't evolving or changing at the rate that it is now. I really do. I mean, think about like how often now, like just new languages are being developed and new frameworks and new tools and just new open source projects. And
at joke pace, at a pace that's so fast, it's just funny. It's like, cool new framework. Yeah, that's great. Let me add that to the to-do list that I never get to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, it's joke pace. And you're right about one thing, Chris. It's not just that it's fast, it's that the rate of change is ever increasing. It's like every year that goes by, it gets faster. And it gets faster, not just a little faster, but noticeably faster. So just everything you're saying about keeping up with stuff is just so true.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for me, like what this kind of reinforces is just like, you need to be continually learning. And you also you definitely have to be taking ownership of your own personal growth, because I really do, like, the game has changed. It's no longer, because everything is changing so quickly, it's no longer where you can just say, like, I'm in the education mode of my life, right? AKA college, or, some kind of like formal training. And then after that, I'm out in the world, right? And I'm doing the work and a practitioner. And like in the past, it was like, you might every once in a while go for some training, right? Or, whatever, but it really wasn't like a big important part of the job, right? Like you were really just doing the work, and you were picking up stuff along the way, kind of, and it's like, oh, there's this new thing out there. Like, when the interwebs came along, right, that was new. We kind of, learned about it. But even then, like think about how long it took just for the internet to evolve. I mean, we started making websites in like 94, 95, and we didn't have Ajax until 2006.
Right.
I mean, think about that. It took almost 10 years before we had asynchronous JavaScript in our web pages. Versus like in the last 5 years, we have self-driving cars, and we're talking about having flying taxis. And all the computer vision.
We've always been talking about having flying taxis.
I know, but it's becoming like this real thing. So I think anyhow, like the rules have changed, the game has changed. And at the end of the day, like, I think the really, kind of like the aha thing here was like, learning, you're never done with it. It's going to be just this continual process. And you really are in this feedback loop, right? This cycle of learn, practice, fail, go back again, learn, practice, fail, and whatnot. So all this really just kind of hit me in the face really hard recently when I was preparing for one of these Mobycast episodes, and in particular it was for the mini-series we did on VPC Ninja, right? So this is episodes 89, 90, 92. We skipped because 91 was an AWS reInvent show. But in that 3-series podcast episodes, we talked about like, hey, how do you set up public versus private subnets in your VPC? Make sure that like stuff that doesn't need to be internet facing is on the private subnets. Once you do that, though, it's like, hey, connecting to these things becomes, you got to come up with different ways of doing it, and you can no longer just simply SSH into those machines that are those resources that are on the private subnets, right? Because there's again they're not listening on the public and public internet. So my intention was, okay, let's, after we kind of talk about how to set up private subnets inside your VPC, then let's talk about how do you go about accessing that. And so for me, my typical go-to solution for doing this has always been, okay, VPN connection.
Right. And I think that I want to just underline this because in the all the specifics that you just listed, this might have gotten lost in those specifics. It's like the whole reason for doing the episode was like, hey, I know something about setting up, getting access to private subnets that a lot of people might struggle with. I'm going to tell them about that. I know how to set up VPN connections to private subnets. That's a thing that I've done over and over again. I'm going to share it with Mobycast audience. Like that, like you felt like you already knew. And so you're going to make an episode around your knowledge. You don't have to learn too much because you know how to do this. Yeah.
I mean, it was, obviously the motivation behind this was like, hey, this is actually not intuitive, easy to do. It's not super sophisticated, but it's one of those things. I'm sure if you went and did a survey of like how many folks out there that are using public cloud, did they really separate their VPC into public versus private subnets? And, or was, all this was just kind of like a stumbling block. Maybe they kind of know they should, but they're not because it's just a big pain in the butt and they don't know how to set it up, or they just haven't taken the time to go and do the research or whatnot. So yeah, it was like, hey, this is something that everyone really should do. It can be kind of difficult and daunting if you haven't done it before. So let me kind of just walk through like something that's really worked well, and take away some of that mystery, right? And kind of show you that it's actually not too hard, right? So that was the whole impetus behind this series. And so again, it's like, hey, a really typical go-to solution that I've used quite a few times, right, is like, okay, let's do a VPN solution for this, so we can use in a VPN, we can access those private resources. And many different ways to go about that. You can do hardware VPNs, or you can do software only. So for the episode, it's like, hey, let's keep things simple. Let's go with the software only VPN approach. And so with AWS, it was, hey, as far like all my experience had been like, what their offerings were. If you wanted to use a software only VPN, that always kind of meant like you're going to go use some third-party software solution, right? And even like AWS Documentation pointed you this way. So they have the AWS Marketplace where there's a bunch of pre-packaged software that's just ready to be spun up onto a AC2, and you can pay for it through the marketplace. You can either buy it outright via licenses, or you can rent it. They list things like Checkpoint and Microsoft as options, as recommendations for this. And then there's also the open source options out there as well. So I hadn't done one of the open source options before, so looked at two in particular. There was OpenVPN, had its access server product, and there was another one called Soft Ether. And internally here at Kelsys, we had looked at Soft Ether before and made a decision to go use that, I think primarily because it's free, it's completely open source, and there's just no cost associated with it. When I was doing some research into this, it kind of really became clear that OpenVPN has much better support, and it's just much more aligned with using it with AWS versus Soft Ether. some of the images out there for using on AWS were really out of date, and it was going to be a lot of work to even just try to get that stood up on AWS. So I said, hey, let's go do this open VPN solution. And so I went through that process, right? So it took me a few hours to go and get the software, install it on EC2, stand it up, configure it, lock it down, and taking copious notes along the way, right? Because I knew I was going to be kind of walking through the high-level bullet points in this podcast episode. And so within a few hours, had this up and running. It's like, okay, cool, done, ready to go. But I wanted to do some final fact checking, right? And I was kind of making sure all the I's were dotted, the T's were crossed in my notes. And I wanted to make sure I had the right terminology, that AWS uses for each one of these products and services, and that I was referencing as alternatives and whatnot. And so I was looking at the AWS documentation as part of this fact checking. And when I did, I actually came across a page where it was listing VPN choices, and I saw two that looked different. Right, I hadn't seen them before, and in particular, saw there's AWS site-to-site VPN, and that was something I hadn't seen in the past before. And then there's this other thing called AWS Client VPN, and I was like, what's this? And so I look into it a little bit more, and it turns out it looks like AWS site-to-site VPN. That is a revamped, renamed version of what AWS previously offered as their VPN service, which was called AWS Managed VPN. So it's like, okay, AWS Managed VPN has now become site-to-site VPN. And so this is a solution, and that solution has always been basically for on-prem locations where you actually have like a piece of hardware that you can update the routing in it to connect to an endpoint in a VPC, right? So it's for some physical location to connect over a VPN into a VPC. And so that's why that requires some amount of hardware, and it's not a software only solution for like remote access users, which is really what I wanted here. And so that was site to site VPN. It's like, okay, fine. Not too different there. But like, wait, what's this client VPN? And that's when it was like just mind blown, because, it turns out AWS Client VPN is this new offering. It's a fully managed service for a software only VPN solution. And not only that, it's basically built, it's native support for open VPN clients, right? So it's like, at first glance, it feels like all this work that I've gone through with, standing up open VPN myself, it's like, it looks like there's just a checkbox here in the AWS console for just standing that up immediately, right? Through this new thing called Client VPN.
You're calling it new, but it's 2018. Like back then, there wasn't even like Fargate for EKS.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing, right? So that's
the point, right?
It's, and as far as like services and technologies go, I think still if it's something within the first year, you can still probably call it new or newish, especially the bigger pieces, right? But yeah, still it had been out there for 10 months when I was going through this process, right? But I hadn't heard it, and not only that, like all the other documentation I looked at was the AWS documentation had been referring to managed VPN, right? Which is what site to site VPN really used to be. So even all, the white papers and the docs hadn't been scrubbed to reflect the new state of the world and the VPN offerings. Right.
And probably another thing is that, Google has a tendency to be the search tool for AWS documentation, right? Because like AWS's own internal search around their documentation is not so hot.
Mm-hmm,
sure. So you just Google stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And it takes around that amount of time, like a year, for Google to pick up on some stuff. Like, all that you're Googling AWS VPN, you're going to get all that old stuff for a long time. before you finally start getting the new stuff, or before it starts bubbling up, before it gets into that first page.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I was just almost, really kind of like stumbled upon this. And it was really, like I said, it really took me by surprise. I was like, I can't believe like this exists. And I really didn't know about it. How did I miss this? And kind of thinking about it, it's like, there's really a couple lessons learned here. And one was like, okay, I hadn't been vigilant about reading the updates on the AWS What's New page, right? So if I had gone, made this like a weekly thing, right, to go to the What's New page and skim the 500 updates that happened during that week, right? I'm sure this would have caught my eye, right? To see because it's something that I'd be interested in. And
it's relevant to you. Yeah.
Right. So had I been doing that on a regular basis, right, I would have noticed that. And so that's one lesson learned. But I think the bigger lesson here was the reliance, the almost the hubris of relying on this familiar pattern for solving a familiar problem. Right, so it's kind of like if you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, and it's kind of like that warm, cozy security blanket of like almost like on autopilot for implementing solutions. Like we all do this, right? Like we see things as how we have seen them in the past, and we go and apply what we've done in the past to go solve it. And I think, again, 10, 20 years ago, there was much less danger in that because things weren't changing as quickly. But I think now, like, again, the game rules have been rewritten, and this is a really dangerous thing, right? You can't,
and this was just a specific software choice. Like, at the end of the day, it's still the same thing. Like, well, are you going to use AWS's Client VPN, or are you going to use this third-party one? You're still putting in a VPN. I mean, what if it was like, oh, have you not heard of ABCs? Like, ABCs are the new way to talk to private subnets. Like, that would have been really like, whoa. Yeah. And there kind of is that actually too. Like there whole, yeah,
there is.
Yeah,
there is that will be for a future. There is this concept of like, well, depends on what you need your VPN for. What you're using it for, you really may not need it. If all you really are using it for is for SSHing into machines, there's a better way of doing that, right? You don't need a VPN to do that. But what if you want to connect to an RDS machine using something like Navicat, and your RDS machine's on a private subnet? Well, in that particular case, then you probably do need a VPN, right? You can't use some of these other things like Session Manager to do that.
And then I just want to crank open this wider question, because here we are. Whole thing on Mobycast is, let's try to give back to the community a little bit. We're seasoned software people. Maybe even some people would call us experts. I think I saw some tweet or comment. No, it was like actually a Mobycast review that said, I dare you to try to find somebody more knowledgeable than Chris Hickman.
Oh, I can find those people. Trust me.
Anyway, I kind of joke about that, but the thing is, like, isn't the whole point that we're supposed to be sharing our knowledge? And it's kind of like, whoa, our knowledge is kind of rusty. Like by the time we even get it, it starts to get rusty and old. And so our knowledge is what is the definition of an expert? It's not necessarily that you know all this stuff about all this stuff. It's really that you just have this like body of understanding that comes from, your experience in the field. And like, this is a lesson that you kind of learned, that you've learned before, I'm sure, but it's just kind of caught you off guard. Like, oh, I need to sort of like let my darlings live a little less long than I was before. Maybe that's kind of what you're learning here. But that this Mobycast is not like, oh, let us tell you all the specific things that we know because we're so experienced. It's more like, we're actually learning a lot of the time. In order to produce an episode, we're actually having to learn what's new and what's up to date, because, it's like with anything, if you were writing software, you always have to learn what's new and what's up to date, whether you're doing a podcast episode or writing software.
Absolutely. and this kind of gets into, again, that deeper like exploration of just what is the takeaway from this. But, when I was kind of digesting it, a quote from Stephen King really stuck out at me, that I had seen previously. And so the quote is from Stephen King. It says, kill your darlings, even when it breaks your egocentric little scribbler's heart, kill your darlings. And so what he's referring to there is he's saying like, hey, be ruthless in the editing of your prose, right? So whenever you're writing, like you have to just be just ruthless in the editing of it. And you may, want to hold on to some of those lines or some of those words or expressions or whatnot, but really look hard, and you're gonna have to kill some of those darlings in order to produce the best work. And so he's talking about writing and editing, but I think this quote like works really, really well for us in the tech industry. But instead of our writing that we need to be ruthless on, it needs to be the patterns and practices that we hold on to, right? And so those become our darlings, but we really do need to be prepared to kill them, to let them go, right? Because they're no longer best practice, right? Or there may be a better way of doing it, and the lifetime of those darlings is becoming, I think, can become less and less. So, and it's hard, right? Because it's like it's such an investment to learn new skills and techniques. It's hard fought knowledge gained, and it's only natural for us to want to hold on to that dearly. It becomes like that security blanket. It's our core set of practices and patterns, right? It just think about it. I mean, it's like it's like this natural thing for, I think, everyone, where it's very seductive to kind of solve things on autopilot without causing the pain of thinking, if that makes sense, right? Like it's because it's harder, right? If you actually have to, like, I mean, this is just human nature, right? This is why we have people, they code by just going to Stack Overflow, right? To go find the answer, right? So they can copy paste it. Because that's easier than it is to go and actually think about, okay, what's the algorithm here? Like, how does this work?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but like, I think that the thing about this is that the killing of your darlings has always been the thing, and it's always been the right answer, and it's always been hard to keep up. But it's like true at a more meta level and I'm going to define what I mean by this, than ever before. Like in the 2000s to 2005 or so, maybe the darlings that you were killing were like, oh, I always use my go-tos, like case logic, or like the way that you code, like the certain patterns that you use, like you had a certain way of doing things. And like the thing that you had to learn then was like, oh no, there's these new things called design patterns. And the way that you should write your code is like kind of different now. So get rid of those old bad habits of how you have like these huge if then statements. And then in the like mid aughts, it became even bigger than that. It was like, don't just like get better at programming your one language. Like actually everybody should learn a new language every year. That's like the new thing. You have to learn a new programming language every year. And people were like, I'm going to learn Ruby, and I'm going to learn Haskell, and I'm going to learn Lisp. And like people are writing to each other, this is my language this year. And like now, like that's kind of like, God, why would you bother learning a new programming language every year? Because that's just simply not enough. Like you have to learn, now it's like every year you've got to learn a whole new way of thinking about creating software, like an entirely new paradigm for creating software. Last year was, 2 years ago, it was like containers. And now you've got to learn serverless. Like, oh my God, the whole way we're approaching this is changing. And it's not just like, hope you learned Lisp this year. Right?
Yeah. So
like, it's like bigger every year. And I don't know what's next, right? We've talked about micro VMs. We're talking about, we're not talking about AI on Mobycast that much, but like some of these new things that are circling, like that, they could make it so that even like learning, what we're doing, learning serverless or learning containers is going to feel like, oh, that was small potatoes. Like, look at this new huge thing you have to kind of get your head around.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, again, kind of like now coming full circle, and kind of the title for this is your most important skill. And I mean, I think we've said this before, it's no secret, but really, I mean, the most important skill that you can have is the ability to learn new things quickly, right? And all the mindset that goes along with that. So again, you have to get rid of this idea that learning takes place exclusively during a formal education period. And then after that, you're now into a different phase, right? Instead, it's like you have to embrace this new reality that learning it really is a continual process, and you're never going to be done with your education. And, you were talking about before how, like, hey, it's like, technology is changing quickly, and like even, something that, you may, maybe knowledge that you got even 6 months ago or 3 months ago is actually maybe no longer even current, right? And so, again, just given how fast things are changing, so knowledge is really much less of a currency here, right? And instead, critical thought, the application of knowledge is much more important, and coupling that with the ability to learn, to teach yourself, and to learn new things quickly, right? Like that's what you really need in order to do well here. So right. You need to be flexible with your opinions. You can't hold on to like, this is the way I've always done things, and this is the best way, right? You got to be flexible. You got to be open to new ideas. You need to just stay curious, and you really do need to commit to that growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. And I think we talked about on a previous episode about just the importance of education, but and training and whatnot. But like that growth mindset of like, hey, I need to continue evolving. Like I can't stay static with my thoughts or my knowledge or my training or just the way I do things. I have to be open, and I always need to be growing. You need to be asking yourself like constantly, whether it be like on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, definitely a yearly basis, like how have I grown? Like how do I want to grow? Like how have I, because if you're not growing, you're stagnating, and
right.
Like things are changing so quickly. It's like if you do that for too long, like when you do pop your head up, you're gonna be like, whoa, like right. Everyone, I'm all alone. Like they've all left without me.
We cover a lot of information here on Mobycast, and if you've ever wanted to go back and remind yourself of something we talked about in a previous episode, it can be hard to search through our website and transcripts to find exactly what you're looking for. Well, now it's a lot easier. All you have to do is go to mobycast.fm/show-notes and sign up. We'll send you our weekly, super detailed outline that we use to actually record the show. A lot of times, this outline contains more information than we get to during our hour on the air. So sign up and get weekly Mobycast cheat sheets to all of our episodes delivered right to your inbox. I want to ask you a question, Chris, because I think this will be helpful for some people listening. Because you've done a pretty good job of keeping up, and your skills are not stale. So I want to get what the thing I want to get at is, how do you decide what to kind of focus on and commit to memory versus what is sort of like just in cache that you might flush, right? And one example of something that maybe a couple of years ago would be something like, well, that's something you need to commit to memory, versus now you think about it, it's like, oh, maybe that should be cache stuff. Is like if you look at SQS and some of the esoteric rules around SQS. The SQS is AWS's simple queuing system.
Service.
Yeah? Service. Whatever. Service system.
See, that's committed to hard memory. Yeah.
Right. Which maybe it shouldn't be, right? But anyway, no. The names of AWS services are definitely on the exam if you take the exam. So like, yeah, it has esoteric rules like how long things live and before they're considered to be either processed or not, and it's got things around whether you're going to get things in the order that they went in, and it's got rules around what to do with things that failed to process. And all of that stuff is super critical to making a working system. I'm not going to ever argue about that. Like that is, you really have to get those rules correct if you want to make a system that works correctly. But say you're not in the middle of making a system and you are in the middle of like learning about SQS, and you may, you're pretty sure that at some point in the future, you're going to need to make a system with it. How do you know, and it's with something like that, what stuff should be just kind of cache memory versus what should be long-term storage? Yeah.
I mean, it just depends on what level that you're working at, right? So it's like, do you go broad or do you go deep? And it's really, it's going to be a combination, but it's very important to be broad and to really understand the general concepts for all these various pieces, right? So it's like, and there are a lot of pieces. So it could be things like caching, like just how does caching work, and when do you use caching versus when do you don't? And what about message queues? Like what are the right use cases for message queues versus not? And like what about event-driven programming and event-driven models of computing? Like what are good use cases for that? And like, when would you use those kind of things? Understanding storage systems and databases and like the differences between SQL versus NoSQL databases and the various flavors of NoSQL. So you don't need to know like necessarily that what DAX is for DynamoDB, right? But you should know absolutely like what DynamoDB is, what advantages it gives over something like, say, Postgres or MySQL or SQL Server, and when you should use something like DynamoDB versus SQL Server.
It's funny because all those examples that you gave are from our future Mobycast episode.
Yeah.
I was going to be like, and that's what Mobycast has been about over the last few years, but actually, no, you just listed off a bunch of stuff we're about to get to.
Right. Yeah. So what's really important is that you can apply knowledge. It's not having the knowledge, right? You have to have some amount of that, right? But it's really, how do you apply it? Because just going and like trying to get every detail, memorizing it and committing to memory, like, what are you going to do with that? Like, if you can't actually apply that and use it to build something, like that's really our superpower, is that, right? If it was just all about memorization of facts and knowledge, like, well, computers can do that. Like they'll always beat us in that, right? So that ability to synthesize the knowledge, apply it, know how to use it, know to be pragmatic with it. This also goes with, when do you kill your darlings, right? Like just because something does come out that's new, that is better and an improvement, like it may not make sense for you to adopt it yet. And so like a good example is like, again, when I was going through this process of demonstrating how to set up a VPN server, and then, near the end, after I set up my own, the third party open VPN access server, come across AWS Client VPN, it's like, wow, this looks really good from a high level. Is this better? And, looked into it a little bit more and actually stood one of these instances up myself and kind of found out, like, it's as with all things that are new, right? There's some warts and it's rough around the edges and whatnot. So after looking at it more closely, it was like, I still think like OpenVPN access server is much better for this particular scenario than using AWS Client VPN, because there's some pretty hardcore constraints with AWS Client VPN, and then also just cost issues that come in with that as well, right? So it ended up working out like, hey, yeah, this is new, and maybe at some point it's going to make sense to, this is the right way to go, and would recommend using Client VPN. But for now, it's this open access VPN server is the right way to go. So being able to do that kind of critical thought and that evaluation, and know like when is the right time to adopt it, and what things you should go chase versus when you shouldn't.
I want to come back though to more specifically how you work, because I think that's interesting. So Chris, like maybe the analogy doesn't work for your workflow, but hopefully it makes sense. Like I talked about, like committing something to long-term memory versus kind of having it just in shorter-term cache. Can you tell me about your actual process for like, how do you actually remember something more permanently versus what do you do when you do need to know something for a while, but you don't want to like put it down deep into your long-term memory?
Yeah. I mean, so obviously this is different for everyone. Everyone has their own learning styles and whatnot. I mean, for me, like a big part of my learning is just experience, right? Like I definitely, like I can read, I do have a pretty good memory, right? So, although it's perhaps not as good as it used to be, but, there's that, but the actual, just the experience of doing something, right, really solidifies it. So, and I've kind of realizing as well as like kind of being a bit more seasoned in this industry and having a lot of experience under my belt, it's really starting to pay off dividends, right? And it makes it easier actually to learn new things because I have like this really core base set of just experience. So like I've gone through all I've built my own B trees from scratch. Right. I've looked at the internals of databases. I've built caching systems. I've had problems with like message queues, and I've had problems with timing outs and socket connections overflowing a server and whatnot. I've studied operating systems, and I kind of know, how those work and whatnot. So all of this stuff and experience kind of builds upon itself and really provides a good base framework. And as much as technology changes, the themes and the concepts, for the most part, are not changing. Right?
Well, so that's not quite where I wanted to, what I wanted to get out of you. Like, yeah. So you've done all this stuff before, and everything new, maybe it reminds you of something you did before. But like, do you write down notes, or do you go like actually like, so you read something new and it's got some code in it? Do you actually go, fire up a code editor and try it out yourself? Like, what kinds of stuff do you do to really commit something?
So it's all of the above. So I do a lot of reading, right, and just skimming. So I'm looking for things that are, I'm looking for the signal versus the noise. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but there's a few kind of so it could be like highlights from Twitter. It could be some of the newsletters that I subscribe to. It could be some of the news sites that I trust. So I'm spending, some amount of time, maybe 30 minutes to an hour a day, just reading and kind of understanding just like what's going on from not just a technology standpoint, but from a business standpoint, just industry standpoint, like what's going on. So there's that. Then for things that are really interesting to me that I want to learn more about, then I might go and go read documentation or just dive deeper into it. If it's really interesting, then I may go ahead and start looking at code or start playing around and writing some code, myself to really evaluate it and see what it is. Right. But I have to be careful. I have, we all have only so many hours in the day to do that. So it just becomes like, for me, just how interesting it is. And also kind of making that decision of like, how important is this for me? Right, is really important too. So, I have to pick and choose what I'm going to chase. I can't chase everything.
Right. Yeah. For me, one of the things that I want to layer on some of my own things that I do. So I do some of the same skimming, some of the same looking at the same sources over and over, looking for things that I start to notice. A lot of people talking about, okay, this is getting a little traction. One thing that you kind of hinted at, but you didn't say explicitly, is that history of experience makes it easier for me to remember things because I can fit them into sort of a framework that I've created in my mind. Like what happened really on a recent episode of Mobycast when we were talking about micro VMs, and we were saying, we were talking about this firecracker process, and I was like, aha, that's kind of like run C is to containers. And then as soon as I said that, then I had just like a nice little place to fit it in to my knowledge. Whereas instead of like a dangling fact that's unrelated to anything else I've ever learned. Now it's like a fact that's related to other things that I've learned before. And that really helps me. If I can draw those parallels to my existing knowledge, then it helps me remember the new thing and understand the new thing.
Yeah. And that's kind of like what I was getting at too, is just like, there's so much in the way of just like cycles in this as well. And like what's old is new again. And so, you know, by understanding like some of the just core concepts and how things work. So again, kind of synchronous versus asynchronous, right? Like just really understanding like what that is. And it's like, there's a lot of stuff that just fits into that, right? You know, serverless itself as a technology, right? Like what does that mean? And define it. But if you're talking about just like say functions, right? Like I'm now, my code is now written in functions, and those functions are invoked on some hardware that I don't control, right? But it's not like this radical. It's maybe you just have to look at it. It's like, well, what changes for me, right? And like what understand like what the benefits are and how you would use it and what it's good for. And
that gets to the second point I wanted to make. So the first one is like, you know, tying it to stuff that you already know. And then the second one is, for me, when I really, like, even if I don't have a project where I can make use of it, when I decide it's like, okay, I've got to get my hands dirty with this, I've got to try it out, is when it's different enough from anything I've ever done before that I feel like it's really outside of my comfort zone. So for me, examples of that were the shift from, you know, Pascal-like languages or like, you know, just like procedural programming to object-oriented programming. It was such a different way of thinking. I had to learn it. Like I just wouldn't have been able to do object-oriented programming without actually doing it. And then the next one, like actually another big one was I mentioned it earlier on the episode. It was like using design patterns. Like I could read about them, but until I actually tried them out, I couldn't get my head around them. It was like factory pattern. I don't really know how that's going to help. Like I can't use it until I use it. And then another one was actually Ruby on Rails. That the whole MVC like kind of magical framework thing. Like I had to do it in order to get it. And then finally like Docker, and then the cloud, and then actually serverless too. Serverless. Oh, and along the way it was like functional programming. Like I had to actually try that to understand what it was about. So those big shifts in like how things get done that really are kind of so different that you can't be like, oh yeah, object-oriented programming is just like if you have a bunch of like, you know, files for each one of your procedures. No, that's not what it's like. That's not what it's like at all. Yeah. You know what I mean? So you couldn't really say it's exactly like this thing that you've done all the time. It's just like slightly different. It's pretty new. So that's when I really have to get my hands dirty. Is that true for you too? So
for the most part, I mean, I think based upon like just my experience and have seen a lot of things and actually have done a lot of stuff, right? And just written lots of code and built lots of systems. Usually I'm able to like, just by doing some research into a particular topic, being able to understand like, okay, where does this fit? And like, what is this? What are the benefits? And, you know, just where does this fit in my model? And that goes a long way to kind of solidifying that. And then of course there is then okay, let's get my hands on this and, you know, roll up the sleeves and get dirty, to really commit it, you know, to memory, if you will, and to understand the mechanics. So like definitely containerization. I mean, at some level, it's like just looking at that and kind of like what problem are containers solving, understanding like all the like having gone through a whole lot of pain, right? It's like, okay, I understand like what this is doing, what pain it's addressing, and like, yes, like this is something that makes a lot of sense. And then now adopting that, right? Then there's like the mechanical process of adopting it. And then there's a learning curve there, right? It's like, okay, like how do I go build one of these container images, and how do I run them? And now how do I do things like logging and monitoring, right? Like that kind of stuff. Like you can read about it, but it's like that to really understand how it works, you're going to have to build something.
Right. And I think that's it. Like, it's like, some of the ones that are big enough, that are sea change enough, that they're really going to impact like the experience of producing software, the experience of creating something that users can use. They're going to have, like, sometimes you can't really predict what that's going to feel like. What is adopting containers really going to do to my day to day? Like, if I build something with this, how's that going to change just like how I build stuff, how I deploy stuff, how I troubleshoot stuff, how I do logging? Like, how's that going to change all that? And you kind of have to try it to really know that and to get it in your fingers, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think the same could be argued for like purist serverless architectures, which I don't necessarily know are a good thing yet. But they definitely change how you do stuff pretty significantly. And then the same could be said
write
with
conditional logic and YAML.
What's that?
Write conditional logic and YAML.
Yeah. If you're using step functions, that's what you're doing. So yeah, like and so that might be just enough for you to be like, yep, we're not ready for this. I don't want to be writing conditional logic in YAML. Let's wait for serverless to move along a little bit further. So yeah, very cool. Like, I just was kind of trying to get at like how you approach this. And I think at the end of the day, it goes back to our main point this episode about, like being able to, like what's most important is that critical thinking and not just like memorizing stuff. And anything that you have memorized is like, fodder for the trash bin pretty soon.
Yeah. Or a candidate to be one of the darlings that is taken out back. Right.
Exactly.
And done away with. So yeah, I think, the thing I really want to stress is just like, it's, some of the most important things you should be doing is just like, you need to be able to learn new things quickly. And if you're not able to, like, if you can't do that, like, that's a big red flag, right? Like, you need to take ownership for that. And you need to make that really one of your top priorities. And then, just having that growth mindset, staying curious, being open to new ideas, but yet also don't just go follow the buzzwords either, right? You'll totally get burned by doing that. So, be open and be curious, but also, have the willpower, the discipline, and the confidence to know, like, whether or not, like, this is something that's worth your time, right? Is it worth your commitment to it? And just own your personal development, right? Like, no one else is going to do it for you. And just really think of it from that. I think it's just so much more important now than it has been in the past. Looking forward, we know that AI and ML it's just going to be a sea change for all industries, including software. So there's a lot that can be automated. And if you're someone that's not keeping up to date, that's not continually learning, that's not applying critical thinking, that can't connect the dots, then that's the kind of stuff that's really going to be easily automated.
But you're probably also not listening.
Hopefully not. Like, all of our listeners, right? Like, maybe they're just like, yeah, okay, whatever. Come on, guys. You're preaching to the choir. Move on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I want to, maybe if there's, what would be fun is if you could think of one example. I was actually just trying, and I don't know if I can do it, but of any time you built a system where you got pretty far along and you're like, oh man, that thing could have been so useful if we had used it and it was available, and I just didn't take the time to learn, and I just relied on my existing knowledge and built stuff the way I always do. I wish I would have known about that one thing. Has that ever happened to you? Outside of like this thing that we talked about with Mobycast?
No, I mean, there's been many times where it was like, oh man, I wish that had been available when I was building it, but it wasn't available for like 5 years later, right? So it just didn't exist at the time, and there's plenty of examples of that. But as far as building something kind of in the moment, and just really,
regretting a tech choice.
No, I mean, most of the mistakes, the regrets have been just in kind of building the wrong thing or having improper assumptions about users. So there's been some pretty hard lessons learned there.
Yeah, that's a whole different thing. Like, the only thing I can think of that's kind of close is we're going through a situation with having chosen React Native on a pretty significant application where it's just really causing a lot of pain as React Native goes through several rounds of incompatible updates that have caused us to have to do full-on rewrites of sections of the app for no new user value. And it's not quite the same, though. It's like, it's not that, gosh, I wish I would have known React Native existed. It could have saved me all this time if I would have been keeping up. It was actually more like the other end of the spectrum, like, oh, it looks like all the signals are good with React Native. We're seeing the big companies adopt it. It's got all these good promising things. So it's time to use it, but maybe, we've talked about the other end of the spectrum. Don't take stuff on too soon that's not really ready to go yet. And I think that's more that end of the spectrum. We decided on React Native before it really had become something that everyone trusts and everyone says good things about consistently for more than a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's a good example because I think it's even a bit more, nuance than that, because for something like React Native, it's like it's really good at certain things. So if you want like a single code base that targets multiple platforms and a mobile app, and you're doing basically kind of like a form-based app and not a lot of complexity there, React Native is a great way to go, right? And it's absolutely the right choice, and I think you'll end up doing just fine. But if you are planning, you need to get more out of it. If you need to do more complicated things and more complicated UI things, or, you need offline scenarios and you need geolocation services and just really lower level access to the hardware, then something like React Native, it's just not going to do well at that, right? And you're just going to spin your wheels with that. And I think,
or just the sheer size of your code base. If the sheer size of your code base is going to be big and you're going to use some libraries, because, people use libraries for different UI parts. Like if it's going to be big, probably also not a good idea. Even if it's fairly simple, it's still not stable enough that you can trust that all your libraries are going to be always, backwards compatible and you're not going to have to rewrite parts. If it's small, if your code base is fairly small, then that's not that painful.
Yep. Yeah, so the big lesson learned is just kind of really when you do adopt things, just understanding what are their limitations, and you have to be prepared to make the hard choice of when do you kill it, and do something, and basically you've outgrown it, right? So it's kind of like you're living in a 2-bedroom apartment, and after the 5th or 6th kid, right? It's like this is not working anymore. We got to go get a house. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think React Native falls into that.
Yeah, it's not quite the same as our lesson of killing our darlings, but it does happen where you just build stuff that that you wish you would have built a different way.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris. Did you have anything else you wanted to mention before we close off for this week's episode?
No, I think we've hammered home the point. Stay curious, make sure you're just constantly learning, and own your personal development.
Cool. Will do. All right. Talk to you next week.
All
Thanks.
right. Thanks, John. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for being aboard with us on this week's episode of Mobycast. Also, thanks to our producer, Roy England. And I'm our announcer, Stevie Rose. Come talk to us on mobycast.fm or on Reddit at r/Mobycast.